Now, to be sure, this definitely isn't a cheap fix. One of these starters from Summit Racing is about $300 with taxes. To be sure, there are cheaper alternatives. Summit has several for less than half the cost. I decided to go this way because I got a 10.5 compression motor. It's a 408 and it's a forged motor, so it's going to get tighter, of course, as it warms up. With the old starter, it would crank just fine cold, but you get a row, row out of it when you try and crank it hot above 200 degrees. As you can see in this photo, they're pretty much identical. The main difference being the motor housing is slightly larger in diameter, but uses the same front end. And here's the other major difference between the two units. The old style starter uses a spade type quick connect. The new type starter uses a bolt-on stud arrangement. In my case, all I did was cut off the quick connect and then crimp on a large enough eyelet to go over the existing stud on the new starter. The kit actually includes the wiring from the starter back to the solenoid switch. This upgrade kit is clearly aimed at you Fox body guys. Me being a 94-95, I use a conventional GM style starter solenoid mounted directly on the starter. The wiring is as you see here. It consists of a number 4 gauge wire with eyelets on both ends and a 12 gauge wire with eyelets on both ends. And yes, I won't need it, so it will be for sale for too much longer on eBay for you Fox guys that would like to upgrade your wiring for your starter. Now, some of you guys are out there saying, well, how did you know that you needed a starter? How come you couldn't just see if you could upgrade the existing one or check your wiring in case there was a problem? Yes, went there, did all that. First thing I did was disconnect the battery and then ohm out the ground connection from the block to the battery, and that came back as less than 1 ohm. I'd already replaced the brushes in the starter. So as you see here, I went ahead and went back, connected up an ohm meter to the starter and to the main terminal going into the starter windings. And again, that came back as about 0 ohms. The next thing to do is check the solenoid itself. And of course, this means just taking the solenoid off the starter and then manually making and breaking the contacts on the solenoid by pushing in the solenoid plunger. And as you can see here, it was pretty close to 0 ohms again. So that was my final confirmation that it's time to buy a new starter. Now on for the optional portion of the program. What I decided to do here was protect the starter from radiant heat coming off the headers and the exhaust system. I already had another use of this radiant heat shielding in another video, so I decided to use a piece of it on the starter and keep the starter cool as well. This is not one of those that, yeah, it's definitely not a cheap fix, but should work real well. It's designed to actually coat the material exposed to the heat and not coat the actual heat source itself. Again, not a cheap fix. About 4 square feet is around 55 to 60 bucks. I decided I'd coat the front of the housing, which is exposed most significantly to the exhaust pipe itself. Actually, the motor is pretty far away from the headers, so I decided I'd just go ahead and coat it too, just to be sure. To do that, I made a little quick paper template and then went back and cut out the actual material. Again, you don't want to waste this stuff as much as it costs. And here's a shot of the starter with the radiant heat shielding installed. It's got an adhesive back on it. It basically consists of a metal layer and then a cloth layer with some insulating material. And then after that, a little peel and stick backing. I remain convinced the best way to put in and take out a starter is from up above. And yes, that means dealing with those rusty manifold bolts or dealing with those rusty header bolts going into your heads. I fully realize that in many cases this is going to be impossible. If you have to take the bolts out, you may wind up having to replace the manifold and possibly part of the exhaust system as well. I've got vivid memories of using a 4-foot long breaker bar from underneath the car to try and break my header flange bolts loose. They were definitely rusted solid. It was quite an experience to go ahead and get the old bolts out, and we decided to put the new engine in. This is the absolute minimum rig you're going to need to actually break things loose from down below. And you may need a long breaker bar to augment this. And now the next little catch, like there's not enough of them, right? You cannot possibly get to the inside nut without first taking out the O2 sensor. Now, in my experience, this is the best designed O2 wrench you can use for your Mustang. Not saying it's not a pain in the tail, it is. It's a definite pain trying to get it up there. It wants to fall out on you. And sometimes you have to put the wrench on before you can actually put the socket extension into the wrench. And now for a little bit of good news. You're going to have to break everything loose from down below, no question about that, which means dealing with the O2 as well as the two nuts here on the flange. The rearward nut can be broken loose from down below and then probably started from up above if your exhaust flanges and bolts are not too rusty. Saves a lot of time as opposed to trying to do it all from down below. In my experience, you can also take the front one and you can reach up in there and get it started from down below without having to worry about the two washers falling out on you constantly. Now here's a couple shots of what it looks like with the header out and the starter off the engine. With the 351, it's still really tight getting the header out of there. It can be done. Best to put it back in is to go ahead and get the header most of the way in after you removed the front stud. It will slide in much easier that way. Now here's a couple shots of why I think it's better to go ahead and put the starter in from up above. If you look closely, you can see the top starter mounting bolt peeking out from behind the exhaust pipe. The next little gotcha is the wiring for the starter is really too short to try to put it on and take it off when the starter is pulled out from down below. Depending on your exhaust system, you might be able to wire the starter from up above by reaching in from the front with the intake, air filter, and plumbing removed. And while it is possible to go ahead and wire it from down below and put it in place, you really can't look and make sure that the wiring is not going to be in contact with something it shouldn't be. And then again, you run the higher risk of a short from the wiring if it gets too close to something like a header or another part that's down there you can't see. With the exhaust manifold or header out, you can clearly look in and make sure that your wiring is going to be in good shape, bolted in good and solid, not in contact with anything it shouldn't be, and don't have to worry about anything shorting out or being loose. And here's another shot clearly showing that that O2 sensor is going to be a problem with respect to getting access to the header flange nut. Now onto the starter bolted connections. As you can see from this one, it actually mounts the O2 sensor mounting bracket on the end of the starter stud. Your starter bolts and studs are 1/2 inch. The nut is 9/16. Here also you have a clear opportunity to make sure that connecting and disconnecting your O2 sensors are not going to be a major clearance issue. You can relocate the bracket accordingly. Now when you're taking the starter out, it's best to go ahead and remove the lower stud first. You want to break loose the upper stud and leave it there. Then if you've got the header off, you can reach up, hold the starter in place while you take the bolt out, and that way the starter doesn't drop freely. Before you do any of this, of course, you need to go ahead and be breaking loose the electrical connections on the starter if at all possible. If you're having to do this from down below, my thoughts and prayers are with you because those electrical connections are going to be a problem because the wires are short, and also getting that upper bolt started is going to be a royal pain. Once you get the bolt started, you can definitely reach in using those swivels and extensions I've shown and tighten it up from up above. I found that tightening and loosening, especially this upper bolt, was best done with the extensions and the ratchet hanging out in front of the cross member down in the open area in front of the engine. Now, in case you were wondering how well does this starter work on a high compression 408,